Abuela's parents had a lush farm, always buzzing with workers. She recounts her father as a virtuous man, never cursing or losing his temper. She grew up guzzling warm milk straight from the cow's tit. She and her brothers would eat so many avocados in one sitting that she once fell off a tree because she was dizzy from gorging on the fruit. She recounts her years as endless seasons of freedom, hanging off trees, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and picking fresh fruit. Abuela learned to read, write, and do basic mathematics by peering through her brother's primary school window. Her father had dismissed the idea of her going to school. The belief about girls' education at that time was that they did not need schooling. Schooling was for the men who had to seek employment outside in a market economy. It was a waste of time in her view. 60% of the population in Colombia were illiterate. Education was an excessive privilege. Abuela did her best to present her case to her dad. She pleaded with him to send her to school. Turning to his daughter, he replied with bewilderment, unable to understand why school would be attractive to her. ¿Para qué, mija? For what, dear? He said. He was always calm, always gentle, never angry, unable to imagine that his daughter's life would be met with deprivation or require her to seek the help of anyone besides a devoted husband who would provide and care for her and her children as he had always done. So this is a section of a fantastic doctoral thesis called Beyond Schools and Jobs: How Can Education Empower Women and Girls to Become? Written by PhD Dr. Claudia Milena Adler. Welcome to the podcast, my dear friend Claudia. How are you doing?
I'm really well. Thank you so much, Johnny, for having me. It was quite emotive, actually, listening to it being read out. So thanks for that.
No, my pleasure. And thank you for writing it and for finally presenting it to me as well, and for joining the show. And I would like you to take us back to your early, let's say, memories of your grandmother, and let's say fill in the missing pieces of this context of her story, and maybe taking us to your purpose of the thesis for actually embarking on doing this amazing research after a fantastic career with all opportunities elsewhere besides in academia, and then looking back at where we are now in the failure of the schooling system, mainstream education, where freedom is actually what we want our children to have again, and maybe not having the generation of, let's say, my son and your children to be stuck in this technological world where maybe we have still too much emphasis on the academic part of education and development.
Yeah, so there's quite a few things there to unpack, and I think I'm going to I'll start with, why did I insert these sort of very personal narratives into what would be an academic thesis? You know, where does it play? So first of all, I also took in sort of ethnography. So this idea of being able to observe, and I practice autoethnography. And I looked at my life. I looked at that of my mother and my grandmother, and they made part of my key stake interviewees, because I think it's really important when we talk about education to be able to discuss these ideas of sort of introspection and reflection. And when we look at sort of our education system, and you talk about there being the failure of a formal mainstream education, I think, you know, I completely agree with you. What we have at the moment is a crisis. It's really a learning crisis. So tying this into the main sort of purpose and the aim of the thesis, it was to understand, what do we mean, or what is empowering pedagogy? So it really started from there. And one of those that led to sort of understanding what is empowering pedagogy is this sort of absence of having a introspective or reflective approach to learning. And so when I looked at my story, when I looked at that story of my mother and my grandmother, I wanted to understand how women within such difficult circumstances, women that grew up within sort of civil war of Colombia, and then my mother grew up within the violence, that sort of urban violence, the cartels, poverty, growing up with an oppressive and abusive father. How were these women able to then become empowered? How were they then able to move continents and make a new life for themselves and identity? Because what we do is we largely look at sort of this social group and we call them vulnerable. And especially if they don't come from a formal education background, like my grandmother, we would then say that, you know, that she's uneducated and she's vulnerable. And we present sort of a whole list of services and prerequisites. And I think what happens in sort of those situations is we miss the opportunity to learn from these women. And that's where this idea of sort of informal education, ancient wisdom, really sort of came out of the thesis.
Yeah, fantastic. So if you take us back a little bit to your personal story with your grandmother, and then to your mother's story, who moved from Colombia to the UK, and maybe you can recount a little bit that story, the struggle of your mother also as a consequence, and then leading up to your own story and your early, let's say, development through education, highlights, down points, well, low points, and then maybe your early career before we dive deeper into, let's say, the research per se.
Of course. So I grew up in Colombia in the 80s. My grandmother grew up in sort of quite a different setting. So her early childhood was actually really beautiful. It was really vibrant. She grew up in the farm. She grew up playing, sort of being very free in that sense. And because of the violence at the time, she had to move into Medellin, which was a completely different setting. And then you had that sort of urban poverty. She then met my grandfather when she was around 18, 19. They married, and he was, I think from day one, he was an incredibly abusive husband. She went through, I think, 30 years of domestic violence, and that was the upbringing of my mother. So unfortunately, my mum didn't get to sort of enjoy that sort of countryside, and she didn't get to enjoy sort of the freedom that my grandmother did. And her experience was very different. It was, you know, she became herself a caregiver at a very young age because she was one of 11 children. And so the kind of responsibilities and stresses that she had were enormous. And when I came along, I think that really motivated my mum to say, you know, I want something else and a different life for my daughter. And that was really, I think, one of her main instigators to be able to leave Colombia. And I talk in, you know, I'll kind of like draw it back to the research in the sense that when I also interviewed a number of other women within the Global South, and I wanted to understand again, because they came from very difficult circumstances as well. And it's not to say that our story is particularly different, because, you know, we have sort of incredible stories of sort of hardship and overcoming those hardship everywhere you look. But I think what was quite interesting about being able to sort of interview these women and also reflect back into sort of my own family history, what is sort of this idea of kind of what allows people to walk into this unknown. So my mother moving from Colombia to the UK was a huge unknown. And it's within sort of this idea of challenges and suffering that then we really understand, or we begin to understand, who we really are. And I think that's an incredible learning process. And I don't think it's discussed enough. And I think within the Western perspective, we label it too quickly as trauma. And it's not to say that there aren't traumatizing aspects to sort of experiencing hardship and violence. There is, but there's also an incredible learning opportunity there. And so what I was able to see is that there are slightly two very different worldviews. One of them is the idea from the global south that life is hard and there are challenges and suffering within life, and that is it. And from a Western perspective, suffering and challenges is an abnormality. And that was something that really came out. And so the way that you are able to confront life and the way that you're able to sort of push forward was that sort of realization point. And that's where you really see, and they're not characters because these are my family, but you really see sort of their narratives take a twist. And say, for example, for my mother, for my grandmother, the church and belief and faith were real important sort of basis for them to have a sense of introspection, and I'll go back to that, and sort of really reflect and almost carve like different identities, because we came from a patriarchal family, having, you know, a very sort of strong grandfather, and I have a very different relationship to him than what my mother and my grandmother did, because he showered me with love, and in many ways he's been the only father that I've ever known. And so my idea of him was very different. So whereas now my family's own dynamic it's a matriarchy. So it's quite interesting how they've not sort of taken that victimhood mentality, but they've understood and they've gone through sort of those challenges and suffering, and they've carved out that identity. And that's not to say that there aren't sort of impressions and hard impressions that sort of stay with us. But it's very much sort of this idea of almost like when you see a bit of a tapestry, that you see it sort of woven with sort of different threads and colors. I think that's how I see them as well. So they've taken sort of the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, and they've been able to sort of weave through this sort of new identity for themselves.
Incredible. And I think with grandfathers, maybe in general, the older generations were very, old-fashioned might not be the right word, but really the patriarchy, that was maybe the negative side of humanity and male dominance as a consequence of hard times where you really had to be tough. And I think many old people become maybe wiser with time, and I have a similar parallel, although with much milder circumstances here in Finland, with my grandmother being very submissive to her husband, my grandfather, who was maybe not that dominant, but he was still the patriarchy until he became ill, and then all of a sudden my grandmother had to take care of everything, from not even knowing where the bank account was, basically. So the shift in this structure from a patriarchy to a matriarchy is something that I can identify with also, even from this perspective. But I think in general, something that I think we have to come back to, that I would like to stress about your thesis, is the ancient wisdom that somehow we had a few generations losing that. I mean, taking on this dominance perspective instead of this leadership, let's say authoritative, strong, masculine perspective, which is very different from the, let's say, negative dominance that many people take on. In a lack of, I think, understanding of how to be strong men. And now I'm reading a lot about ancient philosophy, like Greek philosophy and so on, and let's say follow these stories of how, let's say, Socrates and his generation of philosophers, and the younger ones, of course, were also soldiers and looking at a stoic way of being, and also at the same time being a part of a community, leading a community in collaboration with, of course, the women. And I don't know really how to think about that in this perspective, and that's something I'm very curious to learn more about, and would like to hear from you what you did in your research then. But before we go to the research, I would like to see why you started your research project, because you were not really into academia that much. You did amazing things. Can you highlight a little bit about your personal story, your career?
So I worked. Sorry, Johnny.
No, and then to go then more deeper into the ancient philosophy, ancient wisdom that you touched upon a little bit as well.
I'm just going to go back quickly to that point that you talk about sort of dominance and patriarchy and matriarchy. I think there are challenges with both structures. When we sort of really look at them, and it's not to say that a matriarchy is better than a patriarchy and so forth, as long as they're balanced and there's compassion and care within this idea of masculinity or femininity. I tend to look at that from a non-gendered ideology. So this idea of sort of energies that we all have. So we all have a masculine energy and a feminine energy. But to go back to that, I think, and to look at my grandfather's story, from an anthropological lens, I think it's really important to not take the individual out of the context, but there is a social and cultural context within that story. And that's why it's an ethnographic chapter, because it looks at that political climate, it looks at that violence within that time, it looks at that colonial history as well. And so I think, when we examine ourselves, we also need to take in that sort of social, cultural, political context when we talk about the situation. And I think particularly there are lots of stresses that we absorb as well. And in many ways, we reflect the culture and the society that we live in. And so if we live in one of violence, one of, illness and sickness, then I think our own habits also demonstrate that. But I'll go back to sort of answering your question about sort of my trajectory. So I, when I arrived here, I was 5.5. I missed Colombia deeply. I remember, I'd say I was unhappy when I arrived here, where you'd think the opposite, mum's just taken her out of sort of, quite a violent setting, and there's this sort of ungrateful child wanting to go back, but I remember I'd look out the window and I arrived in December and I'd say to my mum, where's the sun? I couldn't understand it, because I grew up playing in the streets with my friends. I grew up with, lots of love from my grandfather. I grew up with animals, and it was always adventure, and it was color and music, and it was loud. And so, when I came to the UK, we lived in this tiny apartment that, my mum had worked so incredibly hard and had, also been exploited by employers because she was illegal. And I'm sort of looking at this and I hate it. And so I really feel that sort of constraint of coming from a collective background and then being in sort of quite a sort of cold and individualistic sort of culture in general. We were sort of on our own. And so we didn't have that community network that we were so used to. And I discuss in the PhD that there's sort of a cultural displacement that refugee families also experience. And I really believe that. And that cultural displacement leads to thinking that you're safe or trusting people, because that's almost the structures that you had when you're back home. And when you come here, it's a very different ball game. And so you're not really sort of, you don't have the right sort of knowledge or approaches to be able to navigate successfully a different culture like this. And so I really felt that. So I was quite miserable for a number of years until I got used to life in London, and, it's home now, and it's my, I grew up here, and I get a sense of warmness whenever I'm sort of back in London. And so
how many years take us back a little bit? So your trajectory in the education system, you entered the UK education system and you went through school, first, second, third grade, primary school, secondary school. At what point did you let's say adjust, and how was your adjustment? Did you keep the best pieces of your personality, let's say your playful freedom, let's say, oriented personality into the UK education system, because I'm usually, when I talk here in Finland, well, when I talk in Colombia even, I say that you have to appreciate your social skills, your collective, let's say, mindset, focus on the family, whereas we are maybe very independent here, but we are even too independent, so we become very individualistic. And when you look at the generation of our grandmothers, like my grandmother is 93 years old now, she still lives, but completely alone. She's been living alone since her husband died, my grandfather, when he was 80, which was in 2007. And she never thought she would live that old. But and she has family members close by, but she still lives alone in the same house without anyone really caring for her, besides the 3-4 nurses that come every day on a daily basis, and her daughters as well, who live in the same city. But she lives alone. I mean, my wife is Colombian. Her grandmother passed away a few years ago, and she always lived with one of her sons or daughters the last 10 years of her life. And I feel that we miss a lot of that in our cultures here in the northern part of Europe. And so I'm very curious about, because you have both, really in your DNA almost now. But tell me a little bit about that, or tell us about how you integrated into the UK education system and so on.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's really interesting having sort of listening to you, because I can, for example, my grandmother, she lives with my mother and another sort of my uncles. And so for us, to have my grandmother live on her own, that's a big no-no, because that's why you have family. And so that's that collective sort of identity. But my mother made a promise to her brothers and sisters and to my mother, and she promised that she would bring all of them into Europe, that she wouldn't forget them, that she wouldn't leave them. And so she made a vow, and I think that's really admirable, and I think it's really beautiful, of sort of that solidarity that my family has always shown in sort of difficult times. And she brought every single one of them over, and that, has its own chaos and its own challenges, and also its own support network. And so even at the beginning, when my mum and I were alone in the UK, quickly we began to see sort of an auntie coming, an uncle coming, cousins, and so on. And so I've always had a very vibrant, I think there's also something very particular with my own family because of everything that they've experienced. So there's a lot of, quirks that we sort of manage. And one of the ways that I also see that they've been able to overcome those sort of difficult times in their lives is through humor. So maybe you can see that through your own wife, but we laugh at some of the most, we laugh at things that we shouldn't laugh at. And, there are jokes, which from an outsider's perspective, like, how is that funny? How is that funny? But I think that's sort of one of the approaches that my family's anyway taken to be able to sort of heal from those issues. And laughing is, and making joke or making fun of difficulty, I think, is also something that you can see that's been also reported and researched on from sort of different cultures as well. So going back to the question that
just how many siblings did your mother, or does your mother have? Just
she's one of 11.
11, wow.
Yeah, and I'm an only child, so
wow.
She must have said I've had enough.
Yeah, that's the one thing of the need in Finland, that we need more young people, because we don't have any, let's say, at all enough young people compared to how many we used to be in my grandmother's generation. And here in Finland, it's my grandmother's generation who were like 8, and then my mother's generation only 2. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but sorry, that was very important, I think, still to understand the community, the importance that your mother put on the family and having everyone come with her to a better future.
Completely. And also I think that's something that people don't automatically identify as learning or as education.
Yeah, like my wife always said, la educación empieza en casa. So the education starts at home. And if you don't have a good, let's say, family values, I mean, it's very limited what the teacher can do if you don't have parents who support the learning and development process.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic point as well, because COVID-19 was really interesting when they looked at how students struggled during the pandemic. And I think that was really insightful for various reasons. And obviously with data, you can interpret it in sort of different forms. But one of the things that the data showed was that the longer the children were out of school, the worse their reading and writing. And you could say, yes, that makes sense. You could see it like that, but I actually saw it slightly different. What I sort of really took from that data is that there is a massive lack of a learning within the home structure. That's what I understood from that data. And the little that children are sort of able to learn in school, I think it's a real shame that there's sort of that, you know, what you have sort of largely is that children come home and there isn't that same sort of vibrant learning environment. You know, they're not sort of out exploring most of the time. I think there's a misapplication on online tools and screen and everything else, which I think is also creating...
Yeah, like social emotional skills. I mean, we have apps for that, whereas you can live with a Colombian family 2 weeks and you will develop incredible social emotional skills.
Exactly, that's true. And that's that collective upbringing, which I think there's a lot to learn from it. And it does also come with its challenges. You know, it's not to say that it's all good. No, there are also challenges, and there are different sort of hierarchies that you need to sort of tread very carefully as well. So it's a whole sort of mindful, but yes, there is a huge learning in those environments. And I think my personality, or my kind of natural traits, if you can, you know, if we want to call them that, you know, I was always quite a little bit adventurous, boisterous. I was used to playing out. And so I've kind of really brought that in, and I can see that almost morphing a little bit, because I love to travel. I love to be with communities. I'm constantly, you know, wanting to learn. And I think what the PhD really did was it allowed me to have this space where, for me, the actual learning or the actual pedagogy within my PhD process was the best I've had. And that was only because I was able to really delve into a topic which I found fascinating. And that allowed me to sort of really become creative for the first time within a structural education system. And I almost wish that how I learned within my PhD, that you could have that same learning approach in kindergarten, in primary school, in whatever level that you're at, because you're able to really push yourself in ways that you'd never really think that you had, you know, to be able to sort of write that amount, or to be able to sort of really find yourself being challenged by different, you know, themes, topics, or phenomena, and going back and reflecting within yourself, you know, what does that mean? And taking that back to that sort of broader questions on sort of, you know, who am I, and what's my capacity, and what's my potential. I think that's something that's missing within our formal mainstream education, because it's so much about memorizing, and it's so much test driven, that it places an emphasis on kind of external metrics, rather than sort of really uncovering that student's potential.
And at what point did you, let's say, identify that lack in your own education, going back to your, let's say, integration process, and how you, let's say, performed through primary, secondary education, and did you feel and sense that something was really missing? Or was it as an adult, before you embarked on the PhD, that you really started thinking about the problems in the education system?
So if I reflect on sort of primary school, as a refugee child, I don't think that I had the right sort of socialization within my school. I don't think the teachers really understood my background. I don't think they understood where I'd come from. I was just a quiet child. And I think with quiet children, you can just sit nicely on a mat and you're given a book to read, or you're given something to do or color in. And that's really it. But there isn't, I don't remember really, apart from one primary school teacher. And I remember that she held me differently. She was my first teacher in Primrose Hill. And I remember she'd sit me on her laps and she'd be really warm towards me. And even though there was that language barrier, because at that time I didn't speak English, I felt really happy to be in school. And that was, I think that really draws in sort of the importance of having friendships, bonds, and that idea of sort of social relations within education. And that's actually one of the research findings, which is really important to develop sort of this idea of friendship. And so there's this social element that we all need when we're learning. Secondary school was a bit harsh, to be honest with you. So I didn't go to the best schools. Obviously, with my background, we're a struggling family. My mum's a single mother. And I think I did as well as I could, as I could have. It was very much about sort of, I think the teacher's approach was very much about, how to not have too many, not have too many fights break out in the day, how to make sure that these kids just learn to sort of read, write, and kind of get a job. I think that was kind of the focus of it. So when I kind of came to that realization was definitely as an adult, because I felt unfulfilled. Even though I was working in the private sector, there wasn't anything. I was just working for my monthly paycheck. And as soon as 5 p.m. hit, I was out the door. I was happy to be out the door and to be able to kind of do something else. And I felt unsatisfied. I really did. And so it was that idea of sort of feeling uncomfortable. And I think it's so important to feel uncomfortable in life, because that's what motivates you to then go on and do sort of other things and really explore that. Whilst you can take a different approach and you can have your uncomfortability and you can say, well, this is life and, this is what it is. And some people don't have much of a choice to sort of explore something else because of their social settings, because there isn't that opportunity to be able to say, I don't feel too happy now, I want to explore something else, or I want to go back into education, or do you know what, I've always been passionate about this and I want to explore this. And so I leaned into that uncomfortability, and I think that was the best thing that I could have done, because I really liked sort of this kind of humanitarian studies. So there was always this sort of side of me which was kind of very kind of giving in nature. And when I understood that, and after I did my master's in international humanitarian affairs, which is the course that I now teach as a lecturer.
Yeah, I want to close with that to see what you've been doing. You have some trips to exciting places in the world for your work as well, but let's finish with that. But focus on the research first. I have a lot of questions also about your research before we talk about your present job. But yes, humanitarian affairs was. I also know. I think I got to know you during the time when you had this very beautiful projects about promoting those kind of missions, and please continue how that then translated into doing a PhD, which is very, let's say, theoretical in a sense, although you of course try to bring it to practice and to change the practices that we have that are outdated since a long time. So after I did my master's in international humanitarian affairs, I was still at this kind of within the marketplace. I was still in this kind of like in between worlds, not quite good enough to be able to go in and be a humanitarian because I didn't have those years behind me, and not quite good enough to be able to actually have a complete transition within my work. I could do it from an admin perspective, from kind of more of an administrative perspective, and I still didn't want that. And so after I graduated, my current boss, Dr. Jo Rose, it was my graduation ceremony, and she sat me down. She said, "Claudia, have you thought about a PhD?"
some people do it at the end of their careers, and sometimes people do that right at the beginning of their careers. And Johnny, those things that you grow up with, that I never in a million years thought that I would be able to have the capacity to, or like me, a PhD was kind of that sort of like, really? And she said, yeah, I really think you should look at that. And those words kind of, started something. And I went home and I spoke to my mum, and my mum said, you know what, let's just, she was also a massive sort of help, because my mum was like, let's do it, and I'm going to help you, and don't worry, and I've got your back. And then I started navigating this absolutely new world. My grandmother learned to read and write peering through a primary school window. I don't come from that background. I don't come from, extremely educated parents in the formal sense. I come from more of a struggling background. And so it was really kind of exploring a completely different sort of network. And also you feel like, oh, am I good enough? Really is, am I kind of pushing myself too far? But no, it was the best thing I could have done. And with my experiences, with my lived experiences, that is exactly what I bring into my research. And that's what makes me, I'd like to think, particularly effective, because I work with communities, but I also understand, and not that I'm going through that now, but I understand a certain context that they've gone through. And I think that allows me to have a different perspective. And for me, like if you see a lot of my writing, I focus a lot of my writing on sort of concepts or non-Western concepts of compassion. And if we go on to the humanitarian side of things, what we have within our health system, like what we have within our education system, is a very elaborate, very sophisticated system where we give aid to the vulnerable. And we never learn from those vulnerable people. We never see them as first responders. Like we never see my grandmother, as a very empowered, capable, intelligent and educated woman. But no, it's much easier to call them vulnerable and then be able to sort of impose a particular form of aid or program to be able to build the capacity of these people, rather than looking at ourselves and saying, these systems haven't really brought much peace, hasn't really brought, if we look at our education system, we're not seeing, and let's talk about the West, we're not seeing extremely happy students coming out of this education system. We're seeing sort of levels of depression, mental health issues rising. So perhaps the issue is within the educated rather than the uneducated.
Yeah, I would like to highlight something that I heard the other day, that knowledge applied becomes skills. And I don't know if the same person said or if I added it myself, but skills practiced a lot become wisdom. And I think that is, let's say, the pyramid that we have to look at when we look at education. I mean, education as a word has become inflated. No one understands what it really means. But if we have learning and development in the focus, so education does not mean teaching. You can have a lot of fantastic teaching, but if students are not learning, it's useless. We don't need the teaching if there's no learning happening. So learning and development, but if we have a lot of knowledge, and that's the thing right now, when we have excess of knowledge, our problem is not that we don't have the knowledge anymore. Our main problem is that we have too much knowledge, too much information that doesn't even become knowledge. So information, knowledge, and understanding, those are different concepts that we have to separate and make sure that we understand that, okay, what we teach and learn, is it purely consuming information that stays in our head and is never applied and transferred into skills for the real world to enjoy and prosper from, which in the end becomes wisdom when you really understand on a deep level things. And that's like the intuition that you have after years and years of practice with something. You get an intuition, you know what is right and wrong and so on. But I think in Latin American countries and in many parts of the world, people have a lot of skills through developing their personalities through hardship. And you don't develop your character, your personality by just reading books. And especially now when you don't even have to go to the library and research, like look for the book. You just have everything at the fingertips with your phone or the computer. And there's no let's say, hardship to access the information. So there's no real process and development process happening when you're learning. So that doesn't really become hard, and then you don't really apply, because you just continue learning and learning on a theoretical level, and you don't apply what you've learned. Like someone also said that when you read a book, you should take each chapter, if not each page, and find a key idea that you turn into a practice, that you apply the idea of the book. But like I myself am a victim of, well, victim is not the right word, but victimize myself rather with reading too much and not applying what I've learned. So I know on a theoretical level a lot of things, but since I just continue learning, since I'm addicted to learning, I just read more and more, and I never really, well, I do apply, but not enough. I read too much. I've also mentioned this, that you have a marginal rate of return, let's say, in as an economist, with technology, with learning, with many things. So the more you get of something in the beginning, the more benefit the more it benefits you. But when you have excess of something, it starts hurting you. So, and the same thing now with the learning process. We have too much information, so we don't know what to do with it, so it's hurting us. So we have too much knowledge that is not applied, so it doesn't become skills, and, well, never really wisdom. So that's why I'm very curious about your, let's say, deep dives into ancient wisdom, and what you can see that we're lacking now, and what you would like to emphasize on let's say in your teachings and in general. What are the, let's say, wisdoms that you can identify, and coming from skills practiced, although you don't have the academic knowledge, a lot of people, they don't feel they have the education needed for something to even speak or raise their voice. But I think the skills practiced are much more valuable, especially now when you have excess overflow of information. You need the application, with or without the actual theoretical understanding of what you're doing. So that is where I see that we have a big lack in the education system. And then what ancient, let's say, wisdoms would you like to highlight here in this context?
Yeah, I mean, before I sort of delve into ancient wisdom, and I think you make some really interesting points, because you talk about I really liked when you talk about the consumption of knowledge. And that's something, so I lean on sort of quite a few philosophers who are also practitioners as well. So they didn't sort of just, design theory and philosophy, but they were also practitioners. And I think that's really important. That's almost kind of what you're saying, is to be able to sort of practice what you know and sort of grow in sort of that exercise. And people that I lean on are, for example, Frantz Fanon, Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire, Walter Rodney, James Baldwin. When I look at sort of what do we really mean by education, and if you sort of read some of their work, a lot of them, they're incredibly critical of sort of the education system as we understand it, mainstream education. And, one of my favorites is Paulo Freire, when he talks about that there is no neutrality in education. So you're either there to teach people to become complacent or compliant, but you're not there for sort of this idea of empowerment or human flourishing. And you have, for example, Frantz Fanon, that talks about sort of education as being a system to be able to keep people oppressed. And he, a really, I think, key quote that he talks about, he says, this type of education system was used to hold the colonized people in its grip, and for squeezing their brain in all forms and content, and even destroying their identity. And so I think we're not critical enough of sort of what our education system is actually there to do, particularly sort of why it was designed. And I think it's really important to define education within sort of these different lenses. And so you talk about consumption of education, we talk about the external knowledge, right, which is sort of this external exercise. But then when you contrast this with ancient wisdom, what it is, it's a really sort of sophisticated system of an internal sort of an internal application. You see this with sort of yoga, for example. And I think what lies at the heart of ancient wisdom is to understand yourself. if you look at Hinduism, if you look at Buddhism, if you look at sort of ancient Mayanism, it's the same sort of themes emerge. It's, who am I really? What is my essence? Where do I come from? And so it's much broader within sort of these sort of big questions of sort of existentialism and, purpose and fulfillment, and these ideas of sort of gratitude and mindfulness and being present in the moment and living. And so I think when you begin with the internal and then you interact with external knowledge, it's a completely different shift in the way that you then think, process, because what you have then is the development of independent thought and critical thinking. And we don't have that in our education system. Largely what we have are people repeating. And what happens is there is no creativity in that. There aren't any new approaches coming on, because mainstream education is all about this idea of universality. So we're creating everything the same, the same standards, and we're not the same. And I think as an academic, I don't sit on the equality space. I sit on the empowerment space. And it's not to say that I don't believe in equal opportunities for people. And I think that's really important for me to get out there. But I don't believe that people should be the same. I believe that what we need to do is really drive that empowerment element. Or if you don't like the word empowerment, then let's call it human flourishing. And I think within human flourishing, you'll never have equality, but you'll have this incredible creativity. And so that's where I think that our education system is really strangling potential, because we all have to do the same tests and we need to learn the same modules and we need to, pass the same exams, and what makes me tick won't be what makes the other person tick. But then there's something that I'm bringing in and with a different perspective that perhaps, you're looking at it from a different angle. And when we're talking about inclusivity, diversity, which is sort of hugely important, then we sort of bring in equality. And I think the way that mainstream systems have then applied equality, I think it's actually, I don't think it's very helpful.
Yeah, I agree completely with all of that. And I do think empowerment and enabling of equal opportunities is the key thing that we can do. And I would like to hear you summarize or take us back to when you maybe found a moment where you felt empowered through your PhD thesis, since you were a little bit nervous before embarking on the PhD process. Weren't you already empowered to do whatever you felt was important to you? Or have you found some kind of empowerment of yourself and your abilities to contribute in a larger way to the world through your PhD research and the final publication of the thesis?
So I'll share with you a story, which I think it's in my PhD, but it also kind of links in all my other key stake interviews and that sort of autoethnography that I conducted. And it's about the Musk Deer. Have you heard of it? Mm-hmm. Have you heard the story of the Musk Deer?
Well, very superficially.
I'll summarize really quickly. It's a really good sort of analogy of what empowerment is. And so you have a musk deer in the Himalayan forest, and what happens is during mating season, it sort of there's a beautiful scent that comes from one of its glands, and it smells of blossom. And so you have the musk deer, and it's continuously trying to chase the smell, and it smells it here and then as it goes around, but it's not able to find the source. And so as it's trying to find it, it's poking its nose in all of the thorn bushes and it's hurting itself. And at the end, it's absolutely exhausted because it's never been able to find the source of the smell. And so as it collapses, because it's, tired, hungry, hasn't been able to identify this smell, with one of its horns, it pierces the pouch, it pierces this gland. And from there, it finds out finally that the smell was always coming from him, that it was his own smell. And I think that's very key to understanding empowerment. We are empowered. So women are already empowered, but what you need is a process And that comes with introspection and reflection to be able to identify that you have already that strength within. And so within the mainstream approach of empowerment and education, you need to find education outside because you have nothing. And so what we see is our education system imposes this idea that there's a deficit of knowledge. And we come into work with these children thinking that they have a deficit of knowledge. Children don't have a deficit of knowledge. I can see that in my own children. They're incredibly capable and creative. But we come in, they sit in a classroom and it's like they know nothing rather than building already on what they have. And that's the same when humanitarian workers work with affected communities. They come in thinking that there's a deficit of capacity and knowledge within these people. And so when you talk about my own journey, it was there. It was just being able to go through these processes where you then understand yourself. And it's more like an unraveling. And you're like, wow, I didn't know that, after I've come through this unknown, I see myself in a different light, or I've been able to sort of expand in this aspect, and I've been able to sort of perhaps develop my own writing and my expression. And so it's more of an unraveling rather than a moment where you're like, oh, I'm empowered now. No, it was always there.
It's like the hero's journey, more or less. You have this call to adventure that you need to take to really understand that once you embark on what you were always meant to do, you circle back and come to realize that you actually have everything you need, but with a new, let's say, higher level of understanding. And maybe that is the wisdom that you encounter after actually applying yourself in the world.
Yes, I love that. Yes.
Tell us something about your present work, your humanitarian work. And then finally, I would like to hear you give some empowering words to people around the world that might be very curious to change the education system, their way of teaching, parents as well, how to look at the education at home, and what empowering words could you close with after you first tell us a little bit what you do right now?
Right. So I focus on three main things, and they are writing, working with communities, and teaching. And these are almost like three pillars that I've identified and that I want to get better at. And so it's almost like kind of perfecting my craft in that sense. So at the moment, I am starting to I'm going to begin to write my first book that's sort of obviously based on some of the my PhD chapters. I write articles as well, academic articles, where I examine different sort of approaches. I very much look at sort of ancient wisdom. So within the humanitarian context, there's a really interesting approach that comes from it comes from Latin America, which is called Aini, and it's an indigenous term. And it's called, I don't know, you've probably heard it. There's a lot in sort of Colombian families, and it's hoy por ti, mañana por mí. So today for you, tomorrow for me. And so I try and push these sort of nuggets of concepts of compassion, which aren't just the Christian missionary approach to charity. So I try and sort of say, listen, there are different ways of being compassionate. It's not just this idea of charity, but it's more, I like to move within this notion of mutual aid. And so my work at the moment, I do research, I do humanitarian research. So I go and I look at, try and map out how communities are managing, what are their approaches, and ensure that policymakers within the humanitarian system are also taking that on board and learning from affected communities just as much. So that's that's kind of my community work, or my humanitarian work is very much based on research. And I teach, so I'm a lecturer in international humanitarian affairs, and that's something which I'm very passionate about, because the program, it's an online distance learning master's, but it's given the opportunity for students from all over the world, and I think particularly the global south, who have so many issues with visas and these the UK sometimes isn't the kindest to be able to sort of accept international students. So this is a fantastic way for our students to be enrolled, to learn, and to continue in their humanitarian work. And we sort of critique the humanitarian system, and we look at sort of, how it can be better. So those are the main sort of activities that I'm currently engaged in.
Fantastic. So you really found your wisdom, I see, in your 3 pillars. And well, I would just like to highlight that your thesis is like your first book already. This is like 517 pages long. So that's fantastic content for your book or a series of books. And I would be very happy to have a follow-up to dig deeper into specific topics for maybe even a series of interviews with you to see what you decide to do from now and onwards.
Absolutely. I would love that.
So fantastic, Claudia. It was such a great pleasure to finally sit down and talk to you properly again in the podcast. And any final empowering words to the world of educators and parents that come to mind?
I think what I'll leave sort of your listeners with is empowerment is very much sort of this idea of self-governance. And I think it's deeply stemmed within sort of discipline. And I think once we govern ourselves, we need to, first of all, understand ourselves, govern ourselves. And I think that's very much a key to be able to sort of push forward. I think to reimagine a different future is really important. And I think that's what we should be striving for, that our children and ourselves were able to sort of work towards reimagining different solutions and approaches for our modern day challenges, like, the climate crisis, for example. So, bringing back creativity and discipline.
Fantastic, Claudia. So beyond schools and jobs, how can education empower women and girls to become? And I think this is a topic for everyone, really. And where can people find your thesis? Is it public?
It is, yes. So maybe you can sort of share the link. It's published. It's a whiterose.ac.uk publication. So maybe you can add a link.
Definitely. And where can people find you if people want to get in touch with you personally? Is that possible?
Yeah, of course. LinkedIn is a good one. Just Google my name. I'm very approachable and also very much interested in building sort of more of a conversation around these themes. So if it's provoked any extra thinking or collaborations, then more than happy to be able to sort of join forces.
Fantastic, Claudia. Thank you so much. And I look very much forward to talking again soon.
All right. Take care. Thanks.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.